email you her contact. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. All right. Thank you everybody for joining us today for this event in person, online. We're excited to have you here to have this discussion hosted by the SAIS Middle East and North Africa Club, the North Africa Initiative, and also the Africa Club. It should be a great opportunity to discuss the opportunities and challenges for sustainable development, energy transition in the Middle East and North Africa as Egypt's preparing to host COP27 just here next week. So we've got a great lineup of speakers today. I hope you all enjoy hearing from them. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for today, Senior Fellow and Executive Director of the North Africa Initiative, Mr. Hafid Awel.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you all for taking time of your classes to come. It's lovely to do an event in person now in SAIS. We were all off campus for the last 2 years. Everything was done in Zoom, but I'm grateful for all of you being here. All of you probably know about the COP conferences. This year, it's happening next week, starting next week in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, Sinai. There's a lot of expectations, a lot of potential for this year. We have great experts here to help us. Two of my former colleagues at the World Bank, Paul Limba, who is the acting director now for the environment at the World Bank. He will be going to the conference at the end of this week. He's representing the vice presidency of the Middle East and North Africa. We have Concepcion, who's at the treasury of the World Bank, where all the money is. So you know that she's the important person here.
We're taking from
So she can also help us understand the financial architecture around this issue. We have also Dr. Mohammed Mahmoud, who is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, who's joining us here as the independent mind, who's going to criticize and tell us where all the holes are in the full picture. Mohammed, I think you're also Egyptian, right?
I'm not. That is a very common misconception.
Interesting.
I'm actually Sudanese.
Wow. Well, close enough.
But different. Don't make that mistake.
No, absolutely. I agree with you entirely. Very different. But anyway, so we had Genevieve, who is representing the U.S. aid in the COP27. She is already on site over there. She just texted saying she won't be able to join us, unfortunately. But otherwise, it would have been nice to hear what the U.S. government is also doing. Now, we don't have a lot of time, but I would like to have this as an informal discussion. Let's start with some words from our panelists, and then the opportunity is to be given to you to guide the discussion. What are the issues that you want to ask about? Let me start with Paul from the World Bank. If he can give us a sense of the importance of this COP conference, the expectations. It is billed as the conference for implementation rather than setting up policies like the Paris round. So let's see how optimistic is Paul about what's going to happen next week in Sharm el-Sheikh. Paul?
Good. Good day to all of you. Thank you for the opportunity to interact. Maybe let me introduce myself a little bit more. I mean, I hope you're hearing me well. Just confirm. Alfred, do you hear me well there?
Yes, we hear you very well, Paul.
Okay, great. So I'm Paul Numbaum. I'm Regional Director covering infrastructure at the MENA region at the World Bank. Infrastructure for us includes everything pertaining to energy and also transport and digital and financial solutions, which are likely to come from the private sector. I am currently as well Acting Director for Sustainable Development, and in that capacity, I will be traveling to COP, representing the MENA region there on behalf of my Vice President. I mean, the COP27 is an important COP, as you have noticed. I mean, this COP is about implementation, but it's also a COP for Africa. I mean, that's how it was designed by the Egyptian counterpart. But as you also know, COP28 is going to be hosted by our region again, because it's going to be in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. So we have two COPs being organized in the Middle East, North Africa, and this is for a good reason. I think the good reason for it is that when you look at our region in particular, this is a region that really sits at the center of a climate storm. I mean, what do I mean by climate storm? I mean, we all realize that climate change is a reality. We all realize that there's a climate emergency for our generation. And we all realize that we need to do something different from what we have done over the past. So clearly, we need to change the way we organize our economic activities, the way we live and consume natural resources. So when you look at the MENA region, at least, this is a region that does not contribute more to the global greenhouse gas emission. I mean, the total emission coming from our region is like 8%. Globally. I mean, it represents nothing. You can reduce it to zero, it won't change the trend of the climate situation. So the issue why we are doing climate intervention for the region is not because we are emitting much. The rationale for the region to really step up and stand up and game up its role vis-a-vis climate change are related to the realities that people and our people are facing on the ground. You have the issue of rising sea level. A city like Alexandria in Cairo or the Nile Delta might just be submerged by seawater in the next 20 or 30 years if things don't change. We have all seen the rising temperature. I mean, sandstorms are more and more frequent. We all know about the desertification because most of our cities sit between the land of the desert. And then we have also noticed that coastal land degradation is advancing, erosion is shaping up, accelerating. A country like Tunisia loses almost 1 meter of coastal land every year. I mean, I don't know if you realize what it means. And you have infiltration of saline water, which impacts agriculture. And then I can list on and on and on. At the end of the day, this region, North Africa and Middle East, is also a region that is well known as a region that is facing acute water scarcity. So all of these reasons should motivate us to change and do something different so that we can adapt better to the new situation that we face. And that's the reason why the conversation at COP will not only be about global house gas emission. The conversation at COP27 should definitively be about how do we preserve our environment, how do we help our communities to better adapt to the new realities of climate that we are living through, how do we adapt our economies so that they can better perform in the new context that is going through it. Remember, a country like Jordan, a country like Morocco, I mean, if the water scarcity we have seen over the past 10, 15 years is not addressed properly, I mean, these are countries which are going to face massive challenges. Morocco has been building dams for water storage objective for the past 40 years. But when it doesn't rain, all these dams sit empty. It means agriculture will be challenged. Agriculture will have to change. It means we need to change the way we practice agriculture, the way we consume water. And more importantly, if water scarcity continues, then you may end up with a massive migration between rural and urban centers. We have estimated at the World Bank that 20 million people in North Africa alone could be subject to internal climate migration. In Morocco, our estimate shows that it's 2 million people by 2050 who could migrate from rural to urban. So all of that are the rationale why the conversation at COP should be really this time around about action. And action meaning government themselves needs to take action to address the thing they can address at the level with the resources that they have. It means the private sector needs to also be mobilized to come in and help address many of the challenges. It also means the international community should game up, stand up, and fulfill its commitment that was made back to Copenhagen. So let me just leave it there. I cannot presume of what COP27 debates and discussion will deliver, but I can see why for our countries, this is something that is important, that has to be discussed honestly, objectively, and the bulk of the action to be made will have to come from our own people. Let me leave it there. Over to you, Alfred.
Thank you, Paul. Let me just ask a follow-up question here, and then we'll go to Concepcion to talk about the financial architecture. But as you pointed out, the region is not really a major contributor to the pollution or to the climate change causes, but it is going to be paying a heavy price for it. That applies to a lot of other countries in the Greater South. The question they are facing also has to do with the level of debts that they are in. It has to do with their ability to access financing to deal with this issue. It has to do also with the political climate in these parts of the world. As you know, a lot of these countries are in major conflicts, major internal upheavals. How do you think realistically that we're going to reach in COP27 at least some very specific steps or outline for these countries to actually move forward with their plans, especially since you're talking now at a level that pretty much everybody accepted that we're going to be dealing with at least 1.5 increase in terms of temperature, but even more, the expectations is it's going to be probably higher, given the feedback loops involved in this. How optimistic are you about this?
Honestly, I'm very optimistic because I believe when we look at the numbers, this is the part that it makes me become more optimistic. I mean, we just completed at the World Bank what we call country climate diagnostic reports. We have done 24, 25 of these. In the Middle East, North Africa region, we did 4, including Jordan, Morocco, Egypt, and Iraq. And when you look at all these reports, they come up with the same kind of basic conclusion. Part of the things that I mentioned earlier are captured in the reports. But it's clear from the reports that action has to come from the 3 main players I indicated earlier. First of all, the bulk of action that is needed in our region is really around adaptation and resilience, because water is going to be scarce, because food is going to be insecure. So we really need to mobilize our intervention to making sure that not only we invest more in new water mobilization resources facilities, but we need to make sure also that whenever we mobilize that water, we use that water efficiently. I mean, can you imagine that in many of the countries which are water scarce today, we do lose a lot of that water because of inefficiency in the management of the water system? I can give you 2 examples. I mean, non-revenue water, which is the indicator we use for efficiency in the water sector. In Jordan, for example, which is a water distressed country, is 50%. What does that mean? 50% of the water that Jordan really mobilized is lost in the system because of leakages, is lost in the system because of inefficiencies of operation. So we need going forward to address that issue. So not everything we need to do to better adapt to the reality of climate is about new money. The new money we need first is to make sure that the system that we have, the resources that we have, we do consume them efficiently. That's number 1 action. That makes me a little bit more optimistic. And then number 2 action is that when you look at the mitigation, I said earlier that we don't contribute much in terms of greenhouse gas emission. But the fact is, we are living in a region where we can generate more power, more green, clean electricity, but with the same kind of facility, but we can do more of it than countries like Germany. So we can ramp up our ability to produce renewable energy, solar or wind, because we have land, we have the sun, and we have the people who can man it. We have a young population. So definitively expanding our ability to generate, produce green electricity is something that is for us an opportunity, which can help us decarbonize our own electricity system, but also help others to do the same by exporting our electricity to them. And in so doing, we can also create jobs. Just imagine if you were to combine the new jobs that you create by generating more power by renewable energy, I mean, power, solar or wind, but you can also create more jobs by supporting policies for energy efficiency. I mean, refurbishing or retrofitting buildings or houses could create massive jobs that we haven't yet created. I mean, we did some calculation across MENA region. Egypt alone could create like 2 million new jobs in that field from now to 2040, 2050. And these are jobs that only requires that you guys in the current education system pick some of these topics and go and run with them. Because honestly, what we need there is to match the demand that the economists will be looking for to the skill that we have right in front of us. So my optimism comes to that. And then the last part, most of the cost of mitigation that countries will have to mobilize in terms of financing could be mobilized through private financing. And what is needed there is just to create the enabling environment. And this is what the role of any government is about. And I think if we do all these things, we should be able to get at least good funding for the mitigation part, create new jobs, create new opportunities, and then get more support from the international communities to accelerate and strengthen our adaptation to climate change. Let me leave it there. Okay.
Thank you, Paul. You're more optimistic than I am about the region, given its oil, past and probably future. I think it's cheaper for them still to actually still use oil than move on. But let me move to Concepcion. Give us a sense of the financial sort of difficulties here. I mean, a lot of these countries, seems to me, are caught between their heavy debt burdens and the amount of money they need to invest to actually make a difference. Right now they can't really reduce it to zero, but at least be able in a position to deal with the future somehow. How can they do that, given that a lot of them don't have these resources? What's the financial architecture globally that would allow them to tap into some form of financial help?
Thank you. So that's an excellent question. And that's something that we are dealing with in Treasury like every single day. So yes, first let me just a sentence to introduce myself, because some of you might think, Treasury, finance, what is she doing in the COP? Well, so finance, and as I'm sure you will know, is a cross-cutting issue and is transversal to any project that the World Bank does, and anything that it's an enabler, no? And actually, for example, one of the problems of many COPs is that where all the pledges of the countries, they are voluntary pledges, right? So at the end of the day, you need money to make things happen, right? So I'm the regional coordinator of Treasury for the MENA region. So in a way, I'm involved in all the financial transactions between the World Bank and the countries, right? So behind each of our projects, there is a loan or a guarantee or a structured finance, and that's what we take care about. And also we do some kind of technical assistance, for example, with the Egyptian green bond that you might have seen it, that was issued last year. I believe with COVID, I get confused. It was, so anyway, or September 2019. So we have been provided technical assistance on all that. But what we can see, and that's why I think in the financial aspect, this is super important, is key, is that as you know, on climate change, there are two main aspects, right? You have adaptation and mitigation, right? Mitigation is an area where financing has developed a lot, right? Because it has to do with energy efficiency. It's easy to measure, and markets like that. They like things that they can measure. You reduce emissions, you can measure that. Megawatts, you can measure. Carbon markets are about energy efficiency, carbon markets are about financing mitigation, right? Although right now we are transitioning after the non-renewal of the Kyoto Protocol to more regional carbon markets rather than a global, but we are working in there. So, but what happens to adaptation, right? That's exactly what Paul was mentioning, and that to the MENA region, this is the major concern. Yeah, right. Because if you are just contributing 8% of the total pollution, how do you finance adaptation? And adaptation is a very difficult thing to find financing. So actually, I challenge all of you, as students, if you want to make a contest to find, we will be happy to listen to your ideas. to finance the mechanism to finance adaptation. Why? Because the effects are local.
This is a challenge you guys really need to take seriously.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We will be more than happy, IMF and us, to listen to you. Why? Because the effects are local, right? If you are polluting in the States, in China, in Europe, things are going to take place also in Africa or in the MENA region. But adaptation, if the sea level is rising, right? And I'm a landlocked country. I don't really care, right? I have other problems, maybe with my population. I mean, at the end of the day, I might be affecting because of migration. That's another thing. Climate refugees. Yes. That's very important. But so how do you finance adaptation, right? So the all carbon markets, they had a transfer mechanism from mitigation financing to adaptation that was called the adaptation fund. So 10% of each carbon asset that was sold, traded in the market was going to this adaptation fund that is hosted at the World Bank Treasury. And then we were just like the financial guys, and then the UN was deciding how to finance adaptation projects, right? But still there is no adaptation mechanism, right? So what do you do? And especially in countries that this is a key point, as you mentioned. And for example, I work in Jordan for a bit, and I deal with them a lot. What do you do in countries where the debt to GDP and they have IMF programs and they cannot indebt themselves more, right? So the whole this is a problem in the whole region. Tunisia as well, right? They are negotiating right now an IMF.
Even in Egypt, I mean, the debt levels of Egypt are
exactly. And don't take it, and believe me, in the World Bank, we were the first ones that we created the green bonds. And so the first green bond was born at the treasury of the World Bank, and a green bond is debt for a country. So when it's a normal bond. So what we have done in Egypt is a normal bond with the same pricing. So, and right now, if you see benefits in pricing, if I'm too technical, let me know.
No.
Okay.
Please,
Okay.
they will let you know.
Okay. So
they're not a shy bunch.
Okay. So if you see benefits in the pricing, that the pricing is lower, it's just because of something that has happened in the market, right? But it doesn't really mean that it's because it's green. What it means is that through this kind of green financing products that are taking place, what is happening is that we are tapping additional investors, right? And that helps, it might help to bring down the pricing, but it's not a matter of being green. But at the same time, you are attracting these additional investors, and you are also bringing more additional financing, no, to the country. But it's debt. It's debt that the Egyptian government will have to pay back. Right. So that's the reason, for example, why the government of Jordan has been saying, listen, if I have to go into all the trouble of reporting, but because that's the heavy burden of a green bond, you have to create interministerial committees to report on every single project and how many megawatts you have produced. I've been in calls where they are asking me about engines of the new energy efficiency transport fleet in Cairo, the buses. I have no idea, I'm not an engineer. So I have to call people in the transport unit and say, hey, this engine is diesel or what is this? Because I'm being asked by investors, no? So you have the green bonds on the one side that they are debt, right? And then, and how do you deal with this, right? And how do you facilitate this private, and I will say, public sector that they could issue green bonds, but for really working of the private too many ideas in my mind of the green financing, you also need the private sector. And I think this is something that, I mean, my colleagues can and you can correct me if you think otherwise, but that we are seeing and realizing more and more. And actually, this was one of the ideas behind the Egypt Green Bond, right? To send a strong message to the market. Hey, we want to play a role in this area. We are going, then we get into the green taxonomies of some countries. We are, for example, working with Morocco on the possibility of a green taxonomy. Then you have also green lines, green bond guidelines. No, we can discuss more later if you want about this. So there are different things that you can do, but at the end of the day, you need to involve the private sector. Why? Because there is not enough money. There are not enough money. There is not enough money in the public sector. And also the challenge is huge, right? So, and these countries are heavily in debt, right? So how do you attract private sector? So in Jordan, for example, we work with them creating green bond guidelines that I'm pretty sure that in the short term, the government is not going to use, but the private sector have those green bond guidelines. So if they want, they can go to the Jordan Securities Exchange Commission and say, I have issued in the Jordanian market a green bond according to the green bond guidelines of the Jordanian government, right? So you are creating incentives for green investors. So for example, for the teachers pension fund of the United States, which is one of the pension funds where everybody wants to tap because apparently it's huge. So, and now they have a percentage of that portfolio that needs to be green. So maybe they can go to Jordan and buy a percentage, no? So this is a way that you can attract investors. The other way, and there, here I will be happy if later maybe Paul tell us why it didn't work, or maybe, you know, if you, because in the MENA region, there have been a lot of attempts to benefit from the solar, right? So I've heard from my engineer colleagues that, for example, Jordan, right, has one of the best environments in the world for solar, because apparently if it's too hot, you cannot use the solar panels. But and in other areas, you need a lot of water. But apparently for some, but why that is not developed, right?
Just to
Yeah.
because when I was in the World Bank, we worked on this. North Africa in general is
Yeah.
considered one of the best solar spots in the world. And the World Bank, when I was there, I was involved in putting together a $5 billion fund that was supposed to be both World Bank and private sector for these countries to tap into. The only one that really tapped into that was Morocco. For some reason, we still, Algeria and Libya, where actually the best spots are in the desert, and also Egypt, have not really developed it. So that's why I was saying to Paul, I'm not that optimistic. For some strange reason, the mindset over there, and you can understand it from a political point of view, is still very much dependent on oil and gas. And there is still not that much of a shift. Water is also another big problem, because some of the technologies that you can do locally, it's not sophisticated, you know, that you want people to be able to produce locally. Depends on a lot of water in a place of the world that has no water. So that's another problem. So there are multiple problems that contribute to this, but I agree with you entirely. It's still not great.
Mr. Numbaum raised his hand.
Sorry?
Mr. Numbaum raised his hand.
Oh, okay. But
No, I mean, I can come in briefly just to clarify that, yes, there are challenges, but I think things have changed a lot in the right direction. I mean, in 2018, remember Benban, I mean, Egypt was able to attract a lot of private investment for more than 2 gigawatts of solar renewable energy. So, so that's really a demonstration that when the right enabling environment is done, the private sector is always willing to come, and they came massively in Egypt. I mean, that's clearly a positive step. And solar for the region is really a win. I mean, it's not something that has drawbacks. I mean, as you see now, the EU is lobbying intensively all the countries in North Africa to import green electricity from Morocco. I mean, there's a line already between Morocco and Spain. There's going to be a second line between Tunisia and Italy, with a third line being built between Egypt and Greece. And there's even a private submarine cable line between Morocco and UK, which is under consideration. All these submarine cable lines are being deployed because, I mean, the intent is to get the green electricity coming from North Africa to Europe, since Europe doesn't have space, doesn't have the same sun radiation. So I think it's an opportunity for the region, really, and things are changing. Even Algeria is now launching tender bids for 2,000 megawatts of electricity generated by private sector using solar. So this is coming also, even Algeria, yeah.
That's very encouraging. And I always thought that that part of the world can start exporting the sun instead of oil when it would be a better, sorry to cut you off, but then
No,
we need
it's-
to go to Mahmoud and then open it for our students to ask their questions.
So I will just finalize because actually you referred to the project I was going to talk about, so that's
fine.
perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, because at the time, that project in Morocco, I think you are talking about the Ouarzazate project.
Exactly. It's
Right, it was financed, there was a part of a North Africa corridor
Exactly.
to export green energy to Europe, right? And it was financed by CTF, the Clean Technology Fund, which is one of the other mechanism, trust funds, by which you can at least subsidize partially a project, right? Then I believe that there are different technologies. I think it might have been better to choose a technology that was not that water intense. I don't know. But then we had the Arab Spring, right? So then what happened? The Tunisia CTF project was paralyzed because of that, right? The Egypt one never happened, right? So I think, and I don't know whether Paul referred to governance, right? That you need, in order for it to work, to anything to work. And I was discussing yesterday with a colleague from the FCB group, the Fragile Conflict and Violence group, that you need a stability and governance, right? So this is something also that that is very, very important, and one of the reasons that my yeah the but yeah I leave it there.
just on the political dimension.
Yeah.
Paul and I were talking before the event. There is a very massive call for demonstrations next week in Egypt, in Cairo, and there's a lot of alarm bells being, everybody's hearing them as a potential beginning of another revolution. The reason for that is because of the debt, the recent loan from the IMF to Egypt, which changed the exchange rate overnight from 16 pounds to the dollar to yesterday was 24 to the dollar, which meant everything in the economy that was imported, a lot of it went up by that much. So there is a lot of anger in the streets. So you can see how these countries are also caught between potential revolution, potential social upheavals, while they are trying to deal with their debt, while they're trying to deal with their environmental issues.
And if
Yeah.
just a last thought on
Please.
what you said, because I think it's very, very relevant for the region. I mean, you know that, and Egypt especially, is this region, 90% of their wheat was coming from Ukraine.
Oh,
Right?
yes, absolutely.
So that has hit, so I mean, this
The
whole
most
thing,
stable kind of food. I mean, is the regular food
Exactly.
of the people on daily basis.
and is Egypt, it was a huge importer, but not only you have Egypt, but you also have Tunisia. I mean, the whole region, Lebanon, we have to lend them on a wheat, for them to buy wheat.
Yeah.
So all this just to tell you that on governments that they already have a very constrained capacity, even the important sometimes is taken over by the urgent, right? So they are facing a lot of challenges, and they are very worried. Governments are very worried because you cannot let people without food and without wheat, and that will bring a political revolution in an already like kind of stable but very. It depends that something
Very
that can,
fragile
very fragile environment, right? So then, if you have to feed your population between that and being green, is like, listen, I have to feed the population,
them,
right? So we are facing a lot of different points here.
Let me go to Dr. Mahmoud, sorry, to comment on what you've heard and any other issues you want to bring up, and then we'll ask our students to join the conversation.
Yeah, sure. Very great points. And, I'll certainly touch on a few of those things. I think both Concepcion and Paul kind of did a deeper dive on some of the things I'll talk about. But just as a brief introduction, my name is Mohammed Mahmoud. I'm the director of the Climate and Water Program at the Middle East Institute. And prior to that, I was more in the technical practitioner world. So my comments are going to be more on the technical side, some in a big picture sense, but just to give you sort of a sense of where I'm coming from. I think in terms of this particular COP meeting, my perspective is a mix of both what the Egyptians have put forth as being a focus for the meeting, as well as what I feel should be a priority inferred based on what is a priority for the meeting. And so, as Paul mentioned, this was put forth as an African COP, first and foremost. And I think part of that is recognition that the issues that should get the most attention, and I believe will get the most attention, are those that are more salient to the most climate vulnerable nations, basically, such as the case in Africa, as was mentioned, least contributors in terms of carbon or climate emissions, but also tend to be the most affected by the impacts of climate change. So a few things to just note, and some which have already been discussed, that I think will rise to the surface at this particular COP meeting. I 100% agree on this idea of adaptation. I believe adaptation is sort of moving more into the spotlight than mitigation. I think Egypt is very much interested in that. And I think in this COP meeting, we will see that in terms of more emphasis on climate adaptation across the board. Since, as we said, African countries are not large carbon emitters. And so in contrast, may not be as high priority, but one of my final points is almost going to contradict that. But adaptation, the emphasis on it is critical for a number of areas that I think Egypt and Africa really would find interesting. And that's on things related to water resources, and I'll touch on that momentarily. Very critical topic for Egypt. Issues on adaptation for infrastructure and urban environments. How do you make urban environments more climate resilient? And that's where more adaptation comes into play. And then I think briefly mentioned how the connection to adaptation is linked to agriculture and food security, right? So how do you make those systems more climate resilient? And that's primarily through adaptation. How do you protect it from extreme weather? Certainly in North Africa, we saw over the last couple of years, more so last year, a higher incidence of wildfires that are affecting irrigation agricultural districts. Sea level rise, certainly in the long term, is going to affect those coastal communities, which could impact both urban and agricultural areas. So adaptation, I think, is going to be very, very important. Concepcion touched on this, and I'm not a financing expert, so I won't add more than what she has said. But on climate financing, this idea of having more and diverse climate resilience funding for wider application of adaptation projects. And I recognize the challenge that she put forth, that adaptation does tend to be more localized versus global or regional, because you're addressing a particular implication. And also financing, obviously, still on energy transition projects, so a little bit more on the mitigation side. I think conversation on how do you continue to make the Green Climate Fund more effective are valid through expanded funding, better operation oversight to streamline applications for and implementation of projects. I think that's an area of improvement that folks are looking towards. And then the third piece, going to water resources, as I mentioned in the top end. Egypt is very much focused in this issue, and climate adaptation efforts should target water resources management areas, particularly in the case of Egypt, due to the sensitivity and singular reliance on the Nile. Yes, there's some groundwater resources, but as we know, those are finite and essentially non-renewable, particularly in a region that doesn't experience much rainfall. Although you could argue the last year with the higher incidence of extreme weather events and extreme thunderstorms, and in the case of the Arabian Peninsula, cyclonic activity, we're getting a little bit more rain than expected. But generally not much natural rainfall that occurs to boost those groundwater supplies. And then, of course, in the case of Egypt, and certainly the part of Africa where Egypt is in, the issues in the Nile, particularly the Blue Nile, of development of the GERD, how climate change is impacting water supply generation and those higher elevation areas, both in the Blue and White Nile, that is generating that water supply that Egypt relies on. Fourth, this idea of revisiting loss and damage. Again, taking the banner forward for most vulnerable nations, those that have not contributed to climate change as much, but have disproportionately felt the brunt of it. Those conversations have tended to be kicked down the road because it creates an awkward scenario where, almost forces the global North to accept responsibility for, historical emissions and how that's impacted the rest of the world, not just the global south. But the last 2 years, and certainly this year in particular, really has been a banner year in terms of the amplified climate change impacts. We've heard some of them in my colleagues' earlier comments. Scorching summer heat wave last year, very significant in the Middle East, this year across multiple continents. The early summer ongoing frequency of dust storm events, both in terms of magnitude and recurrence, it's truly somewhat unprecedented. The intense thunderstorm and flooding, and then all these different impacts and effects that we've seen are more amplified in this year, and you could argue over the last several years, really puts greater justification and a strong case to revisit this idea of loss and damage at the COP meeting more aggressively, and certainly by developing nations and vulnerable nations as more than enough reason to try to achieve that aspect of let's say compensation. And still it is connected somewhat in a sense to financing, because funding those resources have to come from somewhere, and certainly I would guess the expectation would be from the global north. Last point I'll make on critical topic, which is going to sound contradictory to what I said at the front end, but I think as of this week and last week has sort of risen to the surface. I said adaptation is going to take the spotlight more than mitigation, but findings from very recent United Nations reports actually paint a more alarming picture, and kind of released very timely just ahead of the COP meeting, which is how are NDCs performing in terms of projections into the future as far as reducing the potential average global temperature rise. We always hear the 1.5 degree or 2 degree markers, and the NDCs, I think there is urgency now to revisit those based on the 2022 NDC report by the UNFCCC and the emissions gap report by UN Environment that was released last week, that really illustrate and hammer the point of how woefully inadequate our current plans and NDCs are parties to the agreement to meet this truly accelerated pace of climate change in terms of impact, and to actually sufficiently reduce emissions to maintain, put aside the 1.5 degrees, even just to not exceed the 2 degree rise by the end of the century, because the current projections show we're trending now towards 2.8 or close to 3 degrees based on these reports, which now requires something to the effect of 45% more in terms of reductions to emissions than what's indicated by current NDCs. And certainly, the timeline, people focus on 2030. To do that in essentially 8 years would be quite a Herculean effort and task. But I think that should and will, I don't know to what level of priority in the list of all the things I've talked about, will also should, and I believe will also be addressed to some form or fashion. So I'll leave my comments there, and we can move on to these questions.
Thank you very, very much. Let's get you guys involved in the conversation. And if you don't mind, just for the efficiency, we'll take multiple questions. Just let us know who you are, what program are you in at SAIS, and who are you addressing your question to. Please, go ahead.
Okay, hi, thank you so much.
Yeah, so we can get it captured in that.
Yes, hi. Aristoteles, MIPP student. This is a question for Concepcion and Finance. Lee Buckeye, who is a very famous sovereign debt lawyer, has made this proposal for a restructuring for developing countries' debt, whereby creditors would accept part of the interest payment in the foreign currency, and the remainder would be allowed to the debtor countries to spend in their local currency on green projects. This proposal came out about 2 years ago. How do you assess innovations as those, and what are kind of the coordination challenges, and what kind of leverage can the international community, the IMF and World Bank, place on debtor countries?
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Okay, let's go this way. Yes.
Yes, thank you. My question is for Paul. My name is Celia. I'm a second year MAIR student in climate development sustainability. My question is, we've talked a bit today about the potential for Africa to export green energy to Europe and other regions. And so my question is, how can the region balance the dual objectives of developing green energy to export to Europe and strengthen that region's energy security and weaning off of dependence on Russia for gas and other things, while also ensuring its own energy security by making sure that its own people have access to electricity and reducing energy poverty. Thank you.
Let's go one more question and then we'll start.
Sure, yeah. My name is Eljoy, second year MAIR student. And my question is up for grabs for everyone. You guys just mentioned the protests that will be taking place.
No, hopefully not. Will not.
Hopefully
Don't use the future tense.
So, but my question.
You scared her, you know?
Yeah.
My question is about bringing in civil society into the picture and wondering what your opinions are on, you know, the location of COP27 itself, the planning to have a special zone for people who want to maybe protest COP27 in a specific place far away from the conference itself, and whether the civil society feels not included enough in the conversation.
I can assure you, knowing also the UAE, it's going to be far worse next year when it's in Dubai. The demonstrations over there are, you know, a life-threatening event. Anyway, Concepcion, please, let's go ahead with the first question.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. And actually, it's very relevant to the Middle East. As you know, Lebanon defaulted on its debt. And that, I don't know if any of you is Lebanese, that's a very, oh, you are? No, because it's an amazing country.
Our condolences.
No, it's an amazing country. I've been working with them for a very long time with super smart people, yes. But for one reason after the other, it's very complicated, right? So, and we are trying now to help them in the renegotiation of the debt, right? But first of all,
it's massive, right? It's one of the highest in the world, I think.
Yeah, but it was all like a kind of system where, I mean, and we were in a way part of that, right? You will, course, yes. you will put a note and it will fly, like things wouldn't work in the specific way, like the normal way, but somehow it worked until it stopped working, and then everything collapsed. It is amazing the resilience of that people, but first, let me start with the role that the World Bank of IMF can play, right? The World Bank, we don't restructure our debt. Because the whole way, and this, I come from the private sector. I used to work for a private bank. So when I arrived to the bank, I was very, very surprised of how the World Bank manages its, because we are a bank. We are not an NGO or just a developmental institution. We are a bank, we have our credit rating, and we finance ourselves in international capital markets, something that the IMF doesn't do, for example. So for us, if our rating goes down or something, it's a huge impact. All this just to tell you that we cannot restructure our debt, because otherwise it will impact the whole thing of how the World Bank works. So we don't restructure loans and we don't restructure our debt. Other things that can be done is maybe, for example, there is an agreement between the Lebanese government and the US government, and the US takes care of the Lebanon payments for a while. But with us, you cannot do that. And the same with IMF, because we have a kind of cross-subsidy agreement that's our preferred creditor status. So that's one of the reasons, like, so for example, if they default to us, they cannot have an IMF program. So anyway, so, but all this, and since we are talking about COP and nature, just to tell you that it's not so easy. So we have, many people talk about debt for nature swaps. This is something that you might have here. And we have tried to look into that in Suriname, in Armenia, not that I'm aware of specifically in MENA, but this is very difficult and complex to structure and to subsidize, right? Because at the end of the day, on the other side you have an investor, right? Or the teacher of the pension fund in Minnesota that wants to be paid, right? These guys bought that debt with a fiduciary responsibility, right? So, and to be willing to give out your debt, if you want to Google it, the only debt for Nature Swap, I think the Nature Conservancy did something along those lines, a very small one, but I don't think that so far is flying. And then you have all of course the Paris Club, right? You can always go there, but that's normal renegotiation of your debt. So this thing that you were talking about this proposal and then get into local currency and all of that, I mean, on the other side, you have people and you have agreements and fiduciary responsibilities. Restructuring debt is always a big issue with legal and so, and then you get into local currency exchange. How is it going to affect, you know, in the minute you get into local markets, it's quite complicated, even if they are pegged to the dollar, right? Like in Jordan, you have the Jordanian dinar that is pegged to the dollar, but that will be complicated. So I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you.
But, you know, let me, as a person who was in the World Bank for 20 years, this is something that Concepcion cannot say. But the World Bank, we encourage everybody to restructure their debts, right? We tell them, you know, yeah, you should do it because it's good for these countries, but we never do it ourselves. We also fund a lot of these countries, as she alluded to, more politely, but to a point where their debt becomes so obscene that it becomes really difficult for these countries. And then, you know, we try to help them restructure it, but only with other people, not with ourselves. So it is a really complex issue. And the reason is the bank is a bank. I mean, I served on it in various capacity, including the board. It is essentially a bank, like she said. It tries to do something good with that money by providing certain technical assistance and so on. But essentially, it's a bank that needs to be paid back, needs to maintain its financial standings, because the bank doesn't get financed by anybody except themselves. We go out and we issue bonds and so on, and that's how we get it from the market. Paul, do you remember still the question that the
energy security and trade? I mean, it's a good question. Is I think the new scheme to be worked out should not be a replica of the old scheme. What I mean is, the trade of energy is not something that's starting today. I mean, we have been trading energy for many years, but it has been raw materials. I mean, the trade of molecules, either gas or even oil. And when you send raw material, what do? You export the job that comes with it. So it means if we need to trade electricity tomorrow, we will be trading electrons, meaning that we have transformed a little bit the raw material into something else, which is electron. And we should not also limit ourselves to exporting that electrons to Europe without thinking of how our own consumption of these electrons can make our own economy more competitive. What do I mean by that? I mean, we need to make sure that the new scheme of export of energy products or services creates opportunity for countries exporting to create more jobs in their own industries, in their own service sectors, so that it can become more a vibrant kind of economies. And it means that many of these economies will have to diversify further. And what we have seen happening is exactly along this line. When we do the numbers, this is what we also see. For sub-Saharan Africa, I think the issue really is, before you get into trading your gas to Europe, make sure you can use your gas to provide electricity to your own economy. I think we should not do the reverse. The electricity system in sub-Saharan Africa still needs a lot of work, and you still have like 50 to 60% of the population with very low access or even no access to electricity. So sub-Saharan Africa should definitively be thinking about utilizing the new opportunities through solar and wind and whatever to accelerate access. For Northern Africa, the situation is different because most Northern African countries have exceeded, universal access to electricity. The electrification rate in North Africa is close to 100%. So the issue there is no longer, I need to connect more people. The issue there is how do I make sure that the economies receive reliable electricity, which is cheaper, so that I can use it as a driver for my growth? How do I use it as an appeal variable for locating more private investment, so that I can create jobs for my youth, so that we can stop that migration, that crossing the Mediterranean, where kids get killed because they don't have opportunities in their home countries. So I think that's the new paradigm that I would like to see happen. And of course, it takes more time because it calls for a very holistic approach. We should not just be jumping into an agreement for electricity trade without thinking of how we can also use the opportunity of that agreement to secure more private inflows of investment in our own economy. So I hope you understand what I'm trying to explain. I think we should depart from the single kind of silos kind of agreement, which we have signed over the past many years with the EU particularly, to agreement which also look at how we can also get, reciprocity in terms of inflows of investment, right? So, and this is what you see countries like Morocco doing now. You see countries like Egypt also doing. Egypt is positioning itself as an energy hub with that mindset. We would like to establish ourselves as a hub where electricity is green, is cheap, and we can use it as a FDI kind of promoting tool, so that we can attract more investment to come and locate their investment in our countries, so that we can create jobs. So this is what I would respond to your question, but that thinking should always have in mind the energy security dimension. You should never forget that in the world we live, it's a difficult world, and you cannot put all your eggs in one basket. That said, it doesn't mean you cannot trust your neighbor. You can still trust your neighbor while organizing yourself to diversify the supply across different neighbors around you. Instead of depending on one neighbor, you depend on many neighbors. Over.
But Paul, give me a second before we go back to your question. I have a question from a colleague in Zimbabwe and who's watching us online. And his question is, why can't nuclear energy, which is now considered safer and there are new technologies, why can it not be used as a bridge before one can entirely transform into more sustainable sources like the sun and wind and so on? Is there any future to nuclear energy in this scheme or this picture?
Of course, we have seen recently that the EU has brought back nuclear as a green kind of transition fuel, right? It has been brought back to the climate discussion. The first round of discussions seemed to exclude nuclear, but when you saw what's happened with the conflict in Ukraine, nuclear was brought back. As a matter of fact, just to give you, this is a fact, the French have nationalized the power utility. Why? Because they want to further strengthen and accelerate the modernization of a nuclear kind of power system, right? So nuclear is back as a transition. We should not use it as the end of a gain or the end of a process, right? So for countries with no nuclear capacity, I will not even dare thinking of that as a solution. In our neighborhood, like in some countries I work in, I know Egypt, for example, today is working for, they have even launched a tender for a nuclear plant. Jordan is planning to do something quite similar. I don't think that should be the solution for these countries. I think for me, the solution for our countries should be to advance and strengthen regional integration. We need not only to interconnect grids, but we need to promote cross-border trade of electricity. I can rely on my neighbor when I don't have enough. I can buy from my neighbor and vice versa. That makes all of us stronger than trying to create a solution that will only be meaningful to me. And what's happened if that solution doesn't work? And we have seen cases where countries have invested in nuclear plant and 10, 15 years down the road, the plant is still not operational. So I will not go that way. I will probably stick myself to the common sense issue that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you. I hope that our colleague who's listening got the answer. please, your question, I'm gonna direct it to Dr. Mahmoud, because it involves also NGOs and all of that. But then I will ask Paul and Concepcion to jump in if there is anything they would like to respond to.
This is so.
Do you remember his question?
Yeah, about civil society. It's so far from my area, but I will, I'll be brave and take a stab at it. But
the
I
reason
did
why
wanna-
I'm throwing it to you is because these guys are in an organization that is not going to be very welcoming to discuss something outside, that is filled
Agreed,
with the
agreed. But
political dimension.
Agreed. But I'm not risk-free either. But before I jump on that, I just want to jump on something that Paul said, just to kind of add my 2 cents. I'm also of the mind that as we're, thinking about the sort of larger energy transition question, that things like natural gas and nuclear, to me, are what I call intermediate steps towards full, true renewable energy, because there's some equations that need to be fixed before full renewable becomes feasible in sort of application and scale. To his point about connecting grids, I agree, because even if you look at solar, one of the sort of technical knocks against solar that I think will be resolved is, and it is sort of being resolved at the small scale, is this issue of storage, right? You're only generating solar part of the day. How, what do you do when you are not generating solar, and how do you use that power, right? So an intermediate solution, again, is if you connect the grids, you can sell that excess power that you're not able to use and offset to his point, neighboring countries. But I think one of the bigger obstacles, which I truly am optimistic because the research is ongoing in that area, is there is storage now for solar at a small scale, but how do you scale it up for the levels of solar that we're talking about, to begin to have it put a dent in sort of the energy curve or the energy consumption of nations, right? So I think that's a renewable. Wind is a little bit different because that's also intermittent, but has different challenges. But certainly with solar, where the capacity, the opportunities there in the Middle East region and certainly in Africa, solving the storage issue, I think, becomes critical. But there's some intermediate steps, such as sharing interconnected grids and selling, excess power, etc. The civil society question, my perspective is that there will be some sort of discontent. And there's, I think the criticism has been that will folks have an adequate space to demonstrate and protest? We're hearing yes, but promises and expectations change once things are on the ground, right? Depending on how these demonstrations and protests take place, how sort of aspects of the Egyptian government will respond. So, I'm hesitant to project what would happen. Certainly, I don't think I can do that, but there will be a fallout depending on what the protests do and how they're set up, and then what the response will be. And to the point about next year in UAE could also be more problematic. I suspect they'll be watching this closely in terms of how to prepare to create a space for civil society to be able to express themselves, and then what the adequate response shall be. I think there's more, media and certainly public opinion has been more vocal in terms of these types of things. And the example I use is sort of adjacent, but not quite, what's happening with the World Cup in Qatar. Huge coverage on some of the issues there that the public are not necessarily on board with. So I think this is a sort of new ground for the Middle East in terms of how do you deal with freedom of expression and manage it in such a public setting. So those are my 2 cents on that topic.
I agree with you entirely, but I think this is a bigger issue about hosting these global events that relate to everybody, and then somehow allowing certain governments to constrict them according to what their perspective of security. And I think it actually stifles very critical voices that are supposed to and should be a part of the larger conversation. I hate to say it, I'm from the Middle East and North Africa and spent my life on that, but I hate to say that I think there has to be some kind of rethinking of where to host these events and not to do it as a political sort of gift. Okay, let's do it this year in this country because they are giving money or whatever. But I think, the issue of free speech, the issue of the rights of people to speak up, to contribute, should be at the forefront of where to host these events. That's my 2 cents. Anyway, we are 5 or 7 minutes over time. So let me conclude. I want to thank our guests very, very much. It's lovely to see you, Paul. And I hope I'll stop by next time I'm in the headquarters. I'll stop by to say hi. Dr. Mahmoud, thank you so very much for your contribution and joining us. And I hope to see you next time you're in DC. Please reach out. And Concepcion, thank you so very much. You're down here. It's a pleasure meeting you. And I really hope we keep in touch. And thank you, all of our students here. You have the bios of these guys, and if you need to get in touch with them to get jobs or recommendations, John Hopkins Club in the World Bank is one of the largest. There is a huge alumni cohort in the bank. So the bank is always welcoming of John Hopkins size students. So, look into that. Thank you guys very, very much. Safe trip, Paul.
See you soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to be with
Bye.
you.